Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories. Sweat glistened on his skin in the dim light of the hotel room. Theo pressed me against the wall, his lips devouring mine with an almost painful urgency. My hands explored every inch of his naked torso, memorizing every muscle, every scar, every detail that made him real. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to me?" He whispered against my neck, his warm breath sending shivers throughout my body. "You're going to destroy me, Rafael. Maybe that's what we both need," I replied, pulling him closer as if I could merge our bodies into one. The luxurious room at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan was our temporary fortress against the world outside, a world that I had sworn to expose and that he had sworn to protect. The irony of our situation was not lost on me, even through the fog of desire that consumed every coherent thought. His strong hands gripped my face, forcing me to look into his eyes. Those deep blue eyes that had once stared at me with calculated coldness in the rare public photographs, and which now overflowed with a vulnerability that completely disarmed me. "When this story is published," his voice faltered. I pressed my fingers against his lips. "Not now. Tonight doesn't belong to Theodore Blackwood, the billionaire, and Rafael Mendez, the journalist. Who does it belong to, then?" His voice was almost a whisper. "Only Theo and Rafael. Two men who shouldn't want each other but can't help it." When our lips met again, it was with the desperate certainty that we were dancing on the edge of a precipice, and that neither of us was prepared for what would happen when we inevitably fell. Investigative journalism is not for the faint-hearted. It was the first lesson I learned at Columbia, and the one I carry as a mantra after 8 years of digging up secrets of the powerful for the Tribune. My name is Rafael Mendez, the son of Colombian immigrants, growing up on the tough streets of Queens and transformed by the power of truth and the written word. The Tribune newsroom was buzzing that Tuesday morning when I threw my battered backpack on the table. "Mendez, my office now!" The voice of Marina, my editor-in-chief, cut through the typical buzz of the place. Kevin, my editing colleague, raised his eyebrows from across the room. "What did you do this time?" I shrugged, but my stomach contracted. Marina Costa, a former war reporter and current commander of our small but fierce news operation, was not known for summoning reporters to hand out compliments. "Close the door," she ordered as I entered. On her desk lay an unmarked brown envelope. "This arrived for you today. No sender, no fingerprints, delivered by a courier who can't remember who hired him." I opened the envelope cautiously, feeling that familiar rush of adrenaline that only a potential big story provides. Inside, documents related to the 2015 Blackwood-Miyazaki merger, pages and pages of financial spreadsheets, internal memos, and confidential agreements. "Blackwood Industries?" Marina observed as I quickly scanned the contents. "You're poking a giant hornet's nest, Mendez. These figures don't match the public reports," I muttered, my excitement growing as I flipped through the pages. According to those documents, they were on the verge of bankruptcy before the merger. They cheated shareholders, manipulated values, and the source is reliable. "I need to check, but it looks authentic." I looked at her, already feeling that investigative fever taking over. "If it's true, we're talking about corporate fraud on a billion-dollar scale." Marina leaned back in her chair, studying me with eyes that had witnessed wars and revolutions. "Theodore Blackwood is no ordinary adversary, Rafael. His family practically built half of Manhattan. They have politicians, judges, and media CEOs in their pocket. All the more reason to investigate," I replied, determination hardening my voice. "No one should be above the law or public scrutiny." A reluctant smile formed on Marina's lips. 3 months? Don't publish a single word until we have multiple sources confirming every comma. And Rafael?" Her expression turned serious. "Be discreet. People who get too close to the Blackwoods have a habit of disappearing or appearing discredited overnight." The next few weeks were a deep dive into the murky world of the Blackwood empire. With each layer I peeled away, the more rotten the core seemed. The Elliot Foundation, supposedly the philanthropic arm of the family, functioned as an elaborate scheme to launder money and buy influence. Environmental projects were fronts for strategic land acquisitions. Donations to universities ensured control over research that could affect the family's business. And at the center of it all was the enigmatic figure of Theodore Elliot Blackwood III, the heir who had taken over after his father's death 3 years earlier. A man who hardly existed in photographs, rarely spoke in public, and seemed to operate like a ghost, controlling one of the country's largest corporate empires. "I found something on his mother," Kevin said quietly, depositing another file on my desk after everyone had gone. "Elizabeth Blackwood. The yacht accident was a complete hoax. I spent the whole night investigating Elizabeth Blackwood. The accident conveniently without witnesses, the body never fully recovered, the strange transfers from the Elliot Foundation to specialized clinics in Europe. The story had so many holes that it was like a sieve. The next day, I sent my 10th request for an interview to Blackwood Industries. Like the previous 9, it was politely refused by an assistant who neither confirmed nor denied that Theodore Blackwood had even seen my requests. "The lawyers have already started sniffing around," Marina informed me on a particularly stressful Friday. "Standard intimidation for now, but it's going to get worse. I need an official statement from them before I go to print," I replied, rubbing my tired eyes. "I'll try a different approach." Manhattan Life, the rooftop bar at the Ambassador Hotel, was known for its exclusive clientele: Wall Street executives, discreet celebrities, politicians out of hours. It wasn't the kind of place I would normally frequent, but my sources indicated that it was one of the rare public establishments that Theodore Blackwood occasionally visited. It was a long shot, of course. The chance of finding him there on any given Friday was minuscule, but after weeks of investigating the man, I had developed a strange intuition about his habits, and something told me that tonight was my best bet. I ordered a whiskey on the rocks and positioned myself strategically overlooking the entrance. The place was elegant without being ostentatious, with a panoramic view of Manhattan that justified the exorbitant prices of the drinks. It was when he walked in that I felt my whole body react instinctively. Despite the few photographs in existence, I recognized him immediately. Theodore Blackwood had that kind of presence that commanded attention effortlessly. Tall, with broad shoulders perfectly outlined by a gray suit that surely cost more than my 3-month rent. Meticulously cut dark hair, a defined jaw, and piercing, ice blue eyes that seemed to assess everything and everyone with mathematical precision. He chose a discreet table in the corner, ordered something from the waiter, and began to observe his surroundings with studied attention. His eyes passed over me once, then returned, lingering a little longer. A slight twitch in his eyebrow was the only indication that something had caught his attention. It was now or never. I picked up my glass and walked straight to his desk, feeling a rush of adrenaline that I normally only experienced in conflict zones or confronting corrupt politicians. "Mr. Blackwood," I said without preamble, "may I join you, or would you prefer to continue pretending you're here by chance?" A flash of genuine surprise crossed his face for a split second before the mask of impeccable control returned. "Impressive discipline. Please," he replied, indicating the chair in front of him. "And since we're dispensing with formalities, how exactly did you recognize me? There have only been 3 photographs of me published in the last 10 years. 4, actually," I corrected, sitting down and putting my glass on the table. "You forgot the one from your father's funeral in 2018, taken from afar, but still quite revealing." An almost smile touched his lips. "Impressive. It's my job to know faces and stories, Mr. Blackwood." "Theo," he corrected, and I noticed an almost imperceptible softening in his rigid posture. "Theo," I repeated, watching how he reacted to hearing his name in my voice. Something shifted in the air between us, a subtle tension that wasn't just antagonism. "Do you know why I'm after your story? Enlighten me, Mr. Mendez." "Rafael, please." I took a sip of whiskey, studying him. He was younger than he looked in the rare photographs, maybe early 30s, with an intensity in his gaze that no camera had ever captured. "It's not about exposing your fortune or your privacy for sensationalism. It's about the truth behind the Elliot Foundation and how it was used to cover up the practices of Blackwood Industries over the last decade. The Elliot Foundation has donated more than $2 billion to environmental and social causes over the past 15 years, he replied automatically, as if reciting a press release, while simultaneously funding lobbying to weaken environmental regulations that would affect Blackwood's profits, I replied without hesitation. "And then there's the question of what happened to your mother." Something darkened in his eyes, a shadow of emotion quickly suppressed. I had touched a nerve. "You're in dangerous territory, Rafael. His voice dropped an octave, acquiring a velvety quality that strangely gave me a chill that had nothing to do with fear. It wouldn't be the first time. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Look, I'm not here to attack you personally. I'm interested in the truth, and I suspect there's a lot more to the story than the cold, calculating air the world rarely sees. His eyes locked onto mine with a disturbing intensity, as if he was trying to see beyond my professional facade. For a moment, I had the strange feeling that our interaction had turned into something completely different from what I had planned. "What if I told you my side of the story?" he proposed unexpectedly. "Not for publication, just for context." I was genuinely surprised. Theodore Blackwood was notorious for his secrecy. "Why would you do that?" "Because you already have enough information to cause damage, regardless of the truth," he replied with a frankness I hadn't expected. "And I'd rather you understood the full context before deciding how to use it." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation. There was something in his eyes, a momentary vulnerability perhaps, that challenged my preconceived image of him. "All right, when and where?" "My apartment, tomorrow at 8. He slid an address card across the table. I took the card, deliberately letting my fingers rub against his. A test, to see how he would react to the contact. He didn't flinch, and for a second, I had the distinct impression that the temperature between us had risen several degrees. "I don't know if you're too confident or too reckless, Theo. Maybe a bit of both." He stood up, leaving enough money to cover both our drinks. "See you tomorrow, Rafael." I watched him walk out of the bar, his posture impeccable, movements precise like those of an elegant predator. Only when he disappeared through the door did I realize I was holding my breath. What the hell had just happened? That meeting had been nothing like I had planned. And the most disturbing thing, why, apart from the journalistic excitement of the potential big story, was I feeling a completely different churning in the pit of my stomach. "Where are you going?" Kevin almost choked on his coffee when I told him the next morning. "Alone? At night?" "To his apartment, on Park Avenue." "Rafael, that's professional suicide, and maybe literal." He lowered his voice, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "The guy's been avoiding you for weeks, and suddenly he invites you to the wolf's den. Don't you think that's strange?" "Of course it's weird. That's why I'm going. What if it's a trap? What if he's planning to sue you for something you say, or worse?" I showed him the small digital recorder I always carried. "I'm not going without documentation." "I still think you're in trouble," Kevin insisted. "These billionaires don't play fair." "Neither do I, when necessary," I replied with a confident smile that didn't fully reflect how I felt. The truth was that, ever since our brief encounter the night before, I hadn't been able to get Theodore Blackwood out of my head. There was something about the way he looked at me that intrigued me beyond the professional. An unexpected complexity, an electric tension in the air that made no sense between an investigative journalist and the subject of his investigation. And although I would never admit it to Kevin or any of my colleagues, there was an inexplicable attraction that I felt from the moment our gazes met, something dangerous, forbidden, and completely inappropriate. But Rafael Mendez, the journalist who was never fooled by charm or power, attracted to the subject of his investigation? Impossible. This meeting would be strictly professional. I would go armed with sharp questions and journalistic skepticism, not with a totally inappropriate personal interest. At least that's what I kept telling myself as I carefully chose my outfit for the evening. Opting for dark jeans and a navy blue shirt that several people had commented made my eyes stand out. A fine rain was falling over Manhattan when I arrived at the address indicated, an elegant Art Deco building on Park Avenue. I stopped at the wine store on the corner and bought a bottle of Argentine Malbec, one of the best I could find. It wasn't what you'd expect from a journalist trying to impress a billionaire. That's exactly why I chose it. The doorman announced me, and to my surprise, I was directed straight to the private elevator without an escort, a sign of confidence or carelessness that I hadn't expected. When the elevator doors opened directly into the apartment, I was momentarily speechless. The place was spectacular, but not in the way I had imagined. Instead of the cold, minimalist aesthetic I associated with Blackwood's public image, the spacious apartment was surprisingly welcoming. Dark wood bookshelves filled with books that had been visibly read and handled, contemporary art on the wall. That suggested genuine personal taste, and a panoramic view of Manhattan that looked like a living painting through the huge windows. Theo appeared from a side corridor, wearing dark pants and a long-sleeved shirt with the first few buttons open, a much more relaxed version of the man I'd met in the bar. "I hope you like Argentinian Malbec," he said instead of a greeting, holding out the bottle. "An interesting choice," he replied, a slight smile on his lips. "Most people would have brought something French trying to impress." "I'm not trying to impress. I'm trying to understand." Our gazes met, and I felt an electric current pass between us, something palpable, almost physical. "Welcome to my less corporate version of home," he said, leading me through the living room. I noticed a grand piano in the corner and discreet photographs in silver frames, none of which had ever been published. I stopped in front of an oil painting showing two men on their backs, gazing out at the ocean. "Nothing like I imagined," I commented, genuinely surprised by the surrounding. "And what did you imagine?" he asked, opening the bottle of wine I had brought. "Something more sterile, impersonal." I turned to face him. "Your public image is so carefully controlled that I expected something equally calculated. Maybe that's why I keep my private life private." He offered me a glass of wine and indicated the sofa. "Please." We sat down with a polite distance between us. The rain intensified outside, creating a strangely intimate atmosphere. I noticed that he had elegant hands, the hands of someone who could both sign a billion-dollar contract and play the piano that decorated the room. "So," I began after a sip of wine, "shall we talk about your mother? I saw no point in beating around the bush. I was there as a journalist, after all. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Elizabeth Blackwood, born Hayes, daughter of a senator, educated in Paris, she married my father at the age of 20 in a ceremony that the magazines of the time called the wedding of the century," he recited mechanically. "Officially, she died in a yachting accident off the Italian coast when I was 16. And unofficially?" He took a deep breath, taking a long sip of wine. "Unofficially, she's alive. Or at least she was 5 years ago when I received the last confirmed report." I felt my pulse quicken. "Go on?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite my journalistic excitement. "My mother suffered from severe bipolar disorder, undiagnosed for years. When I was 14, she had a psychotic episode during a charity event. It was devastating." Her voice faltered slightly, the first real crack in her controlled facade. "My father used all his power to suppress any coverage of the incident, but he couldn't hide what I witnessed from me." Theo stood up and walked over to the window, watching the city below. The tension in his shoulders told a story that his carefully chosen words tried to control. "After that, she was quietly hospitalized. 2 years of treatments, some more experimental than ethical. When she got better enough, my father orchestrated the accident, an unidentifiable body due to the damage, falsified documents, bribed authorities." I stood up too, unable to remain seated in the face of such a revelation. "Why?" I asked, approaching him. "Because the truth would be an intolerable scandal for the Blackwood empire. A Blackwood couldn't be defective." Those were my father's words. The bitterness in his voice was palpable. "And where is she now?" "An isolated estate in the south of France. She lives under a false identity, with carefully selected medical staff and employees who are generously paid for their silence." "Do you visit her?" "I can't. She doesn't know who I am." The pain in his voice was so raw, so genuine, that I felt something break inside me. This was not the corporate villain I had expected to confront. This was a man carrying a weight I hadn't considered. "That explains why the Elliot Foundation allocates millions to mental health research, even though it's not the official focus," I observed, connecting the dots. Theo turned to face me. We were close now, too close for a professional interview. "It's my way of make up for it, I suppose. I couldn't save my mother from my father's manipulations, but I can try to ensure that other people have access to the treatment she should have had. And that part of the story doesn't appear in the annual reports," I commented without accusation, just observation. "The Blackwood's good deeds always have to be calculatedly visible. The truly significant ones remain hidden." The rain drummed against the windows, isolating us from the rest of the world. The soft light of the city created shadows that danced across his face, revealing contours and expressions that he rarely allowed to be seen. I realized that we were only a step away from each other, the space between us charged with something that went far beyond the journalist-interviewee dynamic. "Why are you telling me this, Theo? Really?" My voice came out lower and huskier than I intended. The question hung between us, loaded with implications. I needed to know if I was being manipulated or if I was seeing a rare display of honesty. Because you're the first person in years who seems to want to meet Theo, not just the Blackwood heir, he replied, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that caught me off guard. His words hit me with unexpected force. I studied his face, now so close to mine that I could feel his breathing. My journalistic instincts warned me to be careful, but something else, something less professional, more primitive, urged me to reduce the distance between us even further. It changes my perception of the story, I managed to say, my voice betraying an emotion I couldn't name. But it doesn't change the facts about how the Foundation currently operates. I didn't expect it to. His eyes never left mine. I just wanted you to understand that there are nuances that your sources don't know. The air between us seemed electrified, dense with unverbalized possibilities. I was about to take a step back, regain some professional objectivity, when he spoke again. There's more, isn't there? About you. About why you chose this path. Why you care so much about exposing the truth. The question caught me off guard. Him turning the tables, the interviewee becoming the interviewer. I grew up seeing injustices that no one seemed to notice or care about, I replied, surprised at my own honesty. My parents worked their entire lives to be exploited by people who would never be accountable to anyone. And you decided that you would be the one to make them accountable. Someone has to. I held his gaze. The world doesn't change on its own. A genuine smile, the first I'd ever seen, lit up his face. We should be natural enemies, you know. The crusading journalist and the corrupt billionaire. Aren't we? The question came out almost as a whisper. In response, his hand came up to touch my face, so lightly that I could have imagined it, but I didn't. The touch was real, warm, electric. I think we're something much more complicated, Rafael. I should have stepped back. I should have remembered my professional ethics, the story I was writing, the boundaries I was about to cross. Instead, I leaned forward, eliminating the space between us. When our lips met, it was as if something exploded inside me. His kiss was urgent, hungry, his hands suddenly on my waist, pulling me against him with a force that turned my legs to jelly. I responded with equal intensity, my fingers burrowing into his perfectly tidy hair, ruffling it as we deepened the kiss. He pressed me against the wall, our bodies now glued together, the heat between us defying the storm roaring outside. His mouth left mine to trace a path of fire down my neck, drawing an involuntary moan from my throat. "This is crazy," I managed to mutter, my voice almost unrecognizable even to myself. "Complete insanity," he agreed, eyes dark with desire before capturing my lips again. I don't know how long we stayed like that, lost in each other, the outside world completely forgotten. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that when we finally broke apart, both panting, something fundamental had changed, not just between us, but inside me. The shrill ring of my phone shattered the moment like shattering glass. It was Kevin. "I have to go," I said abruptly, trying to regain some composure, smoothing out the shirt crumpled by his hand. Theo took a step back, running his hand through his disheveled hair. The vulnerability he had shown moments before was beginning to give way again to the controlled mask of Theodore Blackwood, the untouchable billionaire. "Does that change anything?" he asked as I reached for my jacket. "About your report?" I stopped at the door, turning to face him one last time. "I don't know, Theo. I honestly don't know." And it was true. I went out into the rainy Manhattan night with my body still tingling with desire and my mind in complete chaos. What had begun as a journalistic investigation was turning into something that threatened not only my professional objectivity, but the carefully constructed walls around my heart. In the cab on the way home, I touched my lips, still sensitive from his kisses, and faced a disturbing truth. I was in more dangerous territory than I had ever imagined, and the risk didn't come from the Blackwood empire, but from Theo himself. Did you like this more intense first part? Leave your comments below. What do you think Rafael will do? Follow his heart or his journalistic ethics? Rafael, you look like a zombie. Marina looked at me critically when I entered the newsroom the next morning. "Rough night? You have no idea," I muttered, putting my extra strong coffee on the table. The truth was that I hadn't slept more than 2 hours. I spent the night alternating between reviewing my notes on the Blackwood Empire and reliving every moment, every touch, every kiss with Theo. My mind was in turmoil, professional ethics and personal desire waging an unrelenting war inside me. So, what did the great and mysterious Blackwood tell you? Marina pulled up a chair, sitting down next to me with anticipation evident in her sharp eyes. I hesitated. How could I explain what had happened without revealing that I had crossed every possible ethical line? He confirmed some suspicions about the mother, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Elizabeth Blackwood is alive, hiding in France. The yachting accident was faked to cover up her hospitalization for bipolar disorder. Marina whistled low. That's pure gold, Rafael. Why would he tell you something so explosive? Apparently to contextualize the Elliot Foundation's investments in psychiatric research. It's a personal project of his. And you believe that story? The distrust in his voice was palpable. I've checked part of it. There are transfers from the foundation to specialized clinics that correspond to the dates he mentioned, and I found partial medical records that had been erased, but not completely. Marina studied me for a long moment, her experienced editor's eyes seeing more than I would have liked. There's something different about you today. What else happened on that date? Nothing relevant to the story, I replied, looking away. Rafael, his voice took on that warning tone I knew well. I've been working with you for 8 years. I know that expression. It's the same one you had on the Henderson case. The Henderson case, my first big investigation when I got emotionally involved with a witness and almost compromised the whole report. A rookie mistake I vowed never to repeat. It's nothing like that, I protested, more vehemently than I had intended. I hope not, she replied, standing up, because this could be the biggest story of your career. Don't ruin it for... She paused significantly. Whatever the distraction. When Marina walked away, I opened my laptop and tried to focus on the investigation notes. The information about Elizabeth Blackwood was important, explosive even, but there was much more. The foundation's questionable transactions, the embezzlement of funds, the tax evasion schemes, it all formed the skeleton of a devastating report. But every time I tried to organize the facts into a coherent narrative, my mind went back to the apartment on Park Avenue, to the taste on Theo's lips, to the surprising vulnerability in his eyes when he talked about his mother. Was I compromising my journalistic integrity by hesitating? Or was I just recognizing the humanity behind what I had previously seen as a simple corporate villain? My phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. Last night was unexpected. For both of us, I believe. I'd like to continue our conversation. Lunch tomorrow? Tea. My heart raced in a way that was completely inappropriate for an investigative journalist. How did he get my number? Stupid question. The man controlled an empire worth billions. Getting a phone number was probably as difficult as breathing for him. I should refuse. Set clear boundary. Recover my professional objectivity. Instead, I typed, the conversation, or what came after it? Journalists' club in the village, noon. The place is my territory, not yours. The answer came almost instantly. Both, I hope, and I accept your territory. Although I must warn you that I prefer it when the rules are fluid. The heat that rose to my face had nothing to do with the temperature in the newsroom. I quickly put the phone away, as if someone might read the message over my shoulder. What's up, Mendez? Kevin asked from across the room. You look a bit feverish. I'm fine, I replied, forcing a concentration I was far from feeling. Just following a promising lead. There was nothing clubby or exclusive about the Journalists' Club. It was a modest bar-restaurant in the West Village, frequented mainly by reporters, freelancers, and journalism students, a place where no one would look twice at shabby clothes or intense conversations about politics and scandals. I deliberately chose it as a way of getting Theo out of his natural environment of starred restaurants and exclusive clubs. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a table at the back with a view of the entrance. Part of me still doubted that Theodore Blackwood would actually show up at a place like that. At exactly midday, the door opened and he walked in. The transformation was remarkable. Well-cut dark jeans instead of a suit, a navy blue shirt with the sleeves folded up to reveal strong forearms, and sunglasses that he removed as he entered. He looked younger, less formal, and uncomfortably attractive. Several heads turned as he walked through the place, with that natural confidence that old money and real power give a person. Even though he tried to blend in, Theo radiated a presence that was impossible to ignore. Your territory is interesting, he commented as he sat down opposite me. Authentic, different from the places where you normally have lunch, I imagine. Refreshingly different, he corrected, studying the simple menu. Recommendations? The pastrami sandwich is surprisingly good, And the local beer is decent. When the waitress came, he ordered exactly that, without hesitation. No questions about where the meat came from or elaborate specifications. This adaptable side of him intrigued me, yet another layer that didn't match the public image of the untouchable heir. "So," he began after the waitress had gone, "shall we talk about last night?" Straight to the point. Another surprise. "What's there to talk about? It was an error of judgment on both our parts." "Was it?" His blue eyes studied me with intensity. "It didn't seem like a mistake at the time. I'm a journalist investigating your company. You are the subject of this investigation. Any personal involvement is by definition a conflict of interest." "I understand the theory," he replied, a slight smile on his lips. "But the practice seems more complicated, don't you think?" Our orders arrived, offering a welcome break in the charged conversation. I watched as he bit into his sandwich without concern for refined etiquette, a simple, genuine pleasure on his face. "You know what's fascinating?" he continued after swallowing. "That two people from such different worlds, with such opposite agendas, can feel this—" He paused, searching for the word. "This connection." "Physical chemistry isn't a connection," I retorted, even though I knew that what existed between us was more complex than mere attraction. "And it's certainly not the basis for anything meaningful." "No? Then why did you agree to meet me today?" The question hung between us, challenging. Why, indeed, it would have been much simpler and ethically correct to have refused. "Journalistic curiosity," I replied, knowing it was only partly true. "Liar," he said, but without malice, almost with admiration. "You're better than that, Rafael." Something in the way he pronounced my name sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you want from me, Theo?" "Really?" He put the sandwich on his plate, staring at me with sudden seriousness. "Honesty? I want to get to know you, without the dance of journalist and source, without the predator and prey performance we're both comfortable playing." "Why?" "Because in all the circles I move in, surrounded by people willing to do anything to please me, you're the only one who looks at me and seems to really see me. Not the heir, not the billionaire, not the symbol, just Theo." His vulnerability caught me off guard. "It's rare to find that." "You're trying to manipulate me into softening the story," I said, but without much conviction. "Your story is going to be published. We both know that. It will expose things I'd prefer to keep private, cause damage to the company's reputation, possibly trigger investigations." He shrugged. "It's inevitable at this point." "Then why are we here?" "Because maybe, just maybe, there's something between us that's worth exploring regardless." He leaned forward. "Something that started out as a game of manipulation, yes, but which turned into something different last night." I stared at him, looking for signs of insincerity, of calculation. Instead, I found a frankness that shook my defenses. "I don't do relationships," I finally replied, "especially with people who would complicate my professional life." "Me neither. My last relationship was 3 years ago. It ended disastrously, and since then I've kept people at a safe distance." A wry smile crossed his face. "It seems we're both good at putting up walls." "And that's your argument for—" "What exactly? A case doomed to fail?" "My argument is for honesty, to admit that there's something here that neither of us expected." His hand moved across the table, not quite touching mine, but close enough for me to feel the warmth, and to explore it without expectations, but also without denial. A part of me, the rational professional part, screamed that this was crazy, that I was being seduced not just by the man, but by the dangerously attractive idea of crossing borders, of living on the edge between worlds. Another part, one that rarely allowed itself to be voiced, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected connection was worth the risk. "How would it work?" I asked, surprising us both with the question. "Theoretically." The relief and pleasure that lit up his face made my heart skip a beat. "We separate things. You continue your investigation. I continue to manage the company. But we meet on neutral ground as people, not as journalist and subject." "It sounds simple when you put it like that." "It would never be simple," he admitted. "It would be complicated, risky, possibly destructive for both of us. And yet you want to try." "Yes." There was no hesitation in his voice. "Don't you?" I looked at him. I really did. Seeing not the powerful billionaire who was my target, but the complex man who had revealed fragments of himself the night before. The man whose kiss still burned on my lips, whose touch had awakened something I had kept dormant for too long. "Yes," I finally answered. the word escaping like a confession. God help me, but yes. The smile that broke out on his face, genuine, not calculated, made all the ethical conflict momentarily worthwhile. For the next 2 weeks, I lived a divided existence. During the day, I continued my relentless investigation into the Blackwood empire, interviewing former employees, checking financial records, meticulously constructing a report that would expose decades of questionable practices. At night, I would meet Theo in unlikely places around the city, a small jazz bar in Harlem where no one would recognize him, an obscure art gallery after closing time, a walk along the High Line when the fine rain kept the tourists away. With each encounter, the layers of protection we both maintained gradually crumbled. He told me about growing up as the reluctant heir to an empire built by generations of ruthless men, about the weight of impossible expectations, about the deep loneliness of being groomed from childhood never to trust anyone completely. My father took me to the boardroom when I was 10, he revealed as we walked along the Hudson on a particularly starry night. He introduced me to the board and said, "Gentlemen, this is the future of Blackwood. Don't let him fool you with his harmless appearance." "What a horrible thing to say about a child," I commented, resisting the urge to take his hand. He believed he was preparing me for the real world. In fact, he was teaching me to always expect the worst from people. Theo stopped, turning to me. "That's why you fascinate me so much, Rafael. You see the worst in the system that people like my family have created, and yet you maintain an unshakable faith that the truth can change things." "And you?" I asked, watching his profile against the city lights. "What do you believe in?" "I'm beginning to believe in redemption," he replied softly. "That maybe it's not too late to undo some of the damage." In return, I shared my own story about growing up as the son of immigrants in Queens, about watching my parents work themselves to exhaustion for an American dream that always seemed out of reach, about choosing journalism as a way to give voice to the invisible. "My father always said that there are 2 kinds of people in the world," I told Theo as we shared a bottle of wine on the roof of my building in Brooklyn. "Those who write the rules and those who live under them." He taught me never to accept the second position, and yet here you are, sharing wine with someone who definitely writes some of the rules. There was a tone of self-deprecation in his voice. "Maybe I'm trying to understand the enemy," I teased, a smile softening the words. "Or maybe I'm discovering that the lines aren't as clearly defined as we thought." His fingers found mine in the dark, intertwining with an intimacy that went beyond the physical. Every touch, every kiss exchanged in the shadows of New York. Every conversation that stretched on until dawn brought us closer in a way that neither of us had planned or anticipated. It was dangerous, reckless, completely contradictory to everything I stood for professionally, and yet I couldn't stop. It was during one of these evenings, as we walked along the virtually deserted High Line in a fine drizzle, that our fragile balance was tested. "Kevin thinks I'm compromising my objectivity," I confessed, the raindrops masking the tension on my face. "Are you?" Theo's question was direct without judgment. "Probably." I turned to face him. "My entire career has been built on the premise that I can separate the personal from the professional, that the truth comes first. Has that changed?" His eyes searched mine in the dim light. "Not the search for the truth, but perhaps what I do with it when I find it." I ran a hand through my damp hair in frustration. "How can I publish a story that I know will potentially destroy you and then go to bed with you at night?" Theo moved closer, eliminating the distance between us. "First, nothing you publish will destroy me. It will hurt the Blackwood Empire, yes. It will force changes that may be painful, but are also necessary. You say that now. I say it because it's true." His hand caressed my cheek, its gentle touch in contrast to the intensity of his words. "Rafael, the company you're investigating was built by my grandfather and shaped by my father. I inherited his methods, his secrets, and his faults, and you perpetuated many of them," I pointed out, unable to pull back from his touch even as I maintained my position. "Yes, out of complacency, out of a lack of courage to break with the legacy, out of fear of the unknown." Something changed in his expression, a new, firm resolve. "But I'm not my father nor my grandfather, and maybe your story is exactly the catalyst I need to finally make the changes I've always known were necessary." "That sounds very convenient," I replied, skeptical despite my desire to believe him. "The truth is often inconvenient," he retorted with a small smile. I thought a journalist would know that. Before I could reply, he eliminated the space between us. his lips meeting mine with an intensity that dispelled any coherent thought. The kiss had a new desperation, a need that went beyond physical desire, as if it were trying to communicate something that words couldn't express. By the time we broke apart, both panting, the rain had intensified, soaking our clothes and hair, but I barely noticed, lost in the much more dangerous storm brewing between us. "Come with me," he whispered against my lips. Now. I didn't ask where. I didn't need to. I just nodded, letting myself be guided away from the city lights, to a place where we could just be Theo and Rafael, without the burdens of our identities or responsibilities. The taxi dropped us off in front of a boutique hotel in Soho, discreet, elegant without being ostentatious. Theo already had a key, evidence of planning that in any other circumstance would have made me skeptical. At that moment, my anticipation only grew. As soon as the bedroom door closed behind us, he pressed me against the wall, his hands exploring my body with urgency as his lips traced a path of fire down my neck. I grabbed his soaked shirt, pulling it up impatiently, needing to feel his skin against mine. "Do you have any idea," he murmured between increasingly intense kisses, "what you're doing to me? How you've turned my world upside down?" I didn't answer with words. There were no adequate words for what we were feeling, that volatile mixture of desire, connection, and danger that consumed us. Instead, I let my body do the talking, pulling him closer, letting him feel exactly how much I wanted him. We fell into bed together, a mess of intertwined limbs and discarded clothes. His hands were both gentle and possessive, exploring every inch of my body as if he were memorizing a map. I reciprocated with equal fervor, discovering the contours of his muscles, the texture of his skin, the points that made him moan softly when touched. "Rafael," he whispered my name like a prayer, his eyes meeting mine in the dark. "I need you to know, this isn't a game for me. It's not a strategy. It's real." The vulnerability in his voice completely disarmed me. I touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with trembling finger. "It's real for me, too," I confessed. "That's why I'm so scared." He kissed me then, with a tenderness that contrasted with the frenzied passion of moments before. A kiss that spoke of something much more dangerous than desire. Something that neither of us was ready to name, but that grew between us with every touch, every look, every shared secret. The rest of the night became a mutual exploration of bodies and souls, moments of intense passion interspersed with whispers of confessions and vulnerabilities. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to simply feel, without analyzing, without questioning, without calculating consequences. I fell asleep in his arm, my head resting on his chest, the sound of his heart a strange lullaby. My last conscious thought was that, regardless of the consequences, something irrevocable had happened. The journalist and the billionaire had disappeared, leaving just two men who had found something unexpected in each other, something that no story, no corporate scandal could completely erase. "Rafael, we need to talk." Marina's voice cut through my thoughts the next morning when I arrived at the newsroom. Her tone and expression told me everything I needed to know. We were in trouble. She closed the door to her office as soon as I entered, throwing some photos on the table. Black and white images, grainy but perfectly recognizable. Theo and I kissing on the High Line, entering the hotel together the night before, my hand on his back as we walked through the door. I felt my blood run cold. "Please tell me this isn't what it looks like," Marina said, her voice a mixture of anger and disappointment. There was no denying it. The images spoke for themselves. "Marina, I can explain." "Explain what exactly, Rafael? That you're sleeping with the subject of your investigation? The man whose company you spent months investigating?" She pounded the table with a closed fist. "That's not just unethical. It's potentially destructive to all matter. The story is solid. Every fact verified by multiple sources. It doesn't matter. The moment Blackwood finds out, and they will, as I did, all our work will be discredited. They'll claim that you have a conflict of interest, that you've manipulated information, that you have a personal vendetta." "That's not true," I argued, even though I knew she was right. "The truth doesn't matter in the court of public opinion. You know that better than anyone." She rubbed her temples, visibly trying to calm down. "How did this happen, Rafael? You're the most ethical journalist I know, the most dedicated to the truth above all else." The question hit me like a punch. How, indeed? How had I allowed it to happen? It wasn't planned, I finally answered, the impotence of my own explanation evident even to me. It started as a source then. Something changed, she repeated incredulously. You threw away years of work, your reputation, potentially all of Tribune's credibility because something changed. Her words were like knives, each one finding its target with painful precision. The worst thing was that he couldn't deny their truth. What do you want me to do? I asked, defeat weighing on every word. Marina took a deep breath. I'll pass the story on to Kevin to finalize. You're officially removed from the Blackwood investigation. What? No, Marina, I've been working on this for months. And you've compromised everything in the last few weeks. His voice rose before he controlled himself again. I have to think about the newspaper, Rafael, the credibility of the story. You understand that, don't you? I understood, of course. If I were him, I'd do exactly the same. That didn't make it any less painful. And then what? I asked, dreading the answer. Then? She looked at me for a long moment. That depends on you. When this story is published, when the dust settles, we'll have to decide if there's still a place for you here. The blow was expected, but it still left me breathless. Tribune was my life, my identity. The idea of losing it because of, what? An affair with Theodore Blackwood? It seemed both tragic and absurd. I see, I finally replied, getting up to leave. Rafael, Marina's voice stopped me at the door. When I turned around, I saw not only my publisher, but the mentor who had guided me for years. Is it worth it? Whatever you found with him? Is it worth losing everything you've worked for? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. It was the same question I had been avoiding asking myself. I don't know, I answered honestly, but I'm going to find out. We need to talk, now. Meet me at the cafe where we had lunch. I sent the message to Theo as soon as I left the Tribune building. My mind was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions, anger, guilt, confusion, and a terrible sense of impending loss. He was already there when I arrived, at our table in the back. Something in his expression told me that he had news too. You already know, I said, sitting down opposite him. Not the way you think. He slid his phone across the table. On the screen, a text message. Mr. Blackwood, we have obtained compromising photographs that involve you with a Tribune journalist. We are willing to keep them private for the appropriate price. Blackmail? I asked, stunned. Apparently someone followed us last night, and the night before. His face was tense but composed. It's not the first time I've tried to deal with blackmail. Did you pay? Of course not. It just validates the method and ensures that they continue. He studied me carefully. But you didn't come here because of a blackmail attempt, did you? Marina has the same photos, I replied, exhaustion weighing on every word. I've been removed from the Blackwood story. Kevin is going to finalize it, and when it's published, my future at Tribune is uncertain, to say the least. Theo absorbed the information in silence. I'm sorry, he finally said. I never meant for that to happen. You didn't? The question came out more bitter than he had intended. What was the plan then, Theo? Because a part of me still wonders if all this wasn't an elaborate strategy to neutralize the threat I posed. The pain that crossed his face seemed genuine. If I wanted to neutralize you, I'd have much simpler methods. Lawsuits, legal threats, pressure on your advertisers. I wouldn't have to, he paused, expose myself the way I did to you. I wanted to believe him, desperately. But my years of journalistic skepticism didn't come off that easily. Then what is it? I demanded. What are we doing? Because I've just put my entire career on the line, and I don't even know for what exactly. What do you want it to be? His blue eyes didn't leave mine. Because for me, it's something I never expected to find. Something that makes me question priorities I've taken for granted all my life. Don't throw the question back at me, I protested. I need honesty now, Theo. Total, complete honesty. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. Total honesty? I'm in love with you, Rafael. Something I never planned, never anticipated, and certainly never wanted. His voice was charged with a raw emotion he had never shown before. I started out wanting to manipulate you, yes. I wanted to find out what you knew, assess the threat, maybe find a way to minimize the damage. His confession hurt, even if it wasn't surprising. But then something happened that first night in my apartment, he continued. You saw me. Not the Blackwood heir, not the CEO, not the villain in your story, but me. And I saw you too. The man beyond the journalist, with his own scars, his own battles. He reached across the table, not quite touching mine, but close enough for me to feel the warmth. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And if that means I have to face the consequences of public exposure, a corporate scandal, even losing control of the company my family built, then so be it. The silence that followed was deafening. His vulnerability was so unexpected, so complete, that it left me momentarily speechless. "Your turn," he finally said. "Total honesty, remember." I took a deep breath, confronting emotions I had tried to ignore for weeks. "I'm furious," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "Furious with you for coming into my life and complicating everything. Furious with myself for allowing it to happen, for jeopardizing everything I've worked for, everything I've built." He nodded, accepting my words without defense. "But the worst thing," my voice faltered, "the worst thing is that I don't regret it. Even knowing the price, even seeing everything fall apart, I can't regret a single moment with you. And that terrifies me more than anything else." A small smile touched his lips, not of triumph, but of understanding. "So we're both completely lost." It would seem so. I finally allowed my hand to find his on the table. "What do we do now?" "It depends," he replied, his fingers entwining in mine. "Do you still believe in your story? Do you still believe it needs to be published?" The question took me by surprise. "Yes," I answered without hesitation. "What I found out about the foundation, about the company's practices, the public has a right to know." Instead of disappointment, I saw something like admiration in his eyes. "Then the story will be published. Kevin will finalize it and will face the consequences. Are you willing to accept that, knowing the damage it will cause? Some things need to be broken in order to be properly rebuilt." His expression was resolute. "Perhaps the Blackwood Empire is one of them." I looked at our joined hands, feeling the weight of the moment. "What about us? Is there an us after all this? That's really the question, isn't it?" Theo squeezed my hand gently. "I think it depends on how much we're willing to sacrifice, and whether what we find in each other is worth that sacrifice. My career, it may be compromised at Tribune, yes, but you're one of the most talented journalists of this generation, Rafael. Other doors will open." He paused. Unless you don't want them to open." The implication was clear. He was offering me a way out, a different life, potentially alongside him. The idea was both terrifying and tempting. "I'm not asking you to decide now," he continued, seeing my hesitation. "Just don't close the door just yet. Let's see how things turn out when the story is published. What if the story destroys everything? If whatever exists between us doesn't survive the scandal? Then we'll have our answer." His honesty was brutal but necessary. "But what if it does? What if, after all the storm, we still want to be together?" The possibility hung between us, fragile and powerful. "One thing at a time," I finally suggested. "The story will be published, the world will react, and then we'll see where we are. Together or apart," he agreed, bringing my hand to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply intimate. I left that cafe feeling simultaneously heavier and lighter, carrying the weight of the impending consequences, but also with a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, there was something more important than my identity as a journalist, something that even I didn't fully understand, but that I could no longer deny. The next few days were a strange limbo. In the newsroom, I worked on menial tasks while Kevin finalized the Blackwood story. Some colleagues noticed my withdrawal from the case, and rumors began to circulate, although no one knew exactly why. Marina kept her distance, her disappointment still palpable. Kevin, on the other hand, showed silent solidarity, never asking directly, but occasionally sharing details about the progress of the story. "You did an incredible job on the story," he commented as we worked late on Thursday. "Every source triple-checked, every document authenticated. It's impressive." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely grateful for the recognition. "Are you adding anything new?" A few comments from corporate ethics experts to put it in context. "And I'm balancing his mother's story as you suggested, not as gossip, but as human context." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of pride in a job well done and apprehension about what was to follow. "Can I ask you something?" Kevin lowered his voice, looking around to make sure we were alone. "What really happened? Marina isn't talking, but obviously something big took him out of the story." I considered lying or deflecting, but I was tired of half-truths. "I got involved with Theodore Blackwood, personally." To Kevin's credit, he didn't show the shock he surely felt. "Wow, that's unexpected." Believe me, it was for me, too. Did he try to manipulate you? The question contained no judgment, only genuine concern. At first, maybe. Then, I hesitated, unsure of how to explain something that even I didn't fully understand. Then it got complicated. Kevin nodded thoughtfully. Are you going to publish on Sunday? Yes. The story has already been approved by legal counsel. It's scheduled for the front page. He looked at me hesitantly. Are you prepared for that? No, I admitted with a small smile, but it's going to happen anyway. On Saturday evening, I received a message from Theo. Tomorrow, everything changes. Whatever the outcome, I want you to know that I don't regret a thing. I'll be on the roof of Central Park if you want to meet me. Anytime. I didn't reply immediately. Part of me wanted to run to him, to spend the last few hours before the storm in his arms. Another part, the part that still clung to my professional identity, insisted that I needed to keep my distance, let the story unfold without any more personal complications. It was Kevin who sought me out the next morning as soon as the Tribune started circulating. It's online, he said into the phone, his voice tense. And it's already exploding. The site has had more hits in the last 2 hours than it normally has in a whole day. I opened the site on my laptop, seeing the lead story. The Empire of Shadows, the truth behind the Elliot Foundation, with my name and Kevin's as co-authors. Marina had kept my credit, a small gesture of respect for the work I had done, despite everything. The report was exactly what it should be, detailed, impartial, devastating in its facts, but without unnecessary sensationalism. A meticulous analysis of how the Elliot Foundation had served as a vehicle for questionable corporate practices for decades, with documents, testimonies, and expert analysis. Has Blackwood responded yet? I asked, scrolling down to see the rapidly accumulating comments. Not officially yet, but the stock is already down 7% in the pre-market. Wall Street is panicking. Part of me, the journalist who had devoted months to this investigation, felt the satisfaction of a successful job. Another part of me felt nauseous at the thought of the consequences for Theo. What about Theodore Blackwood? Any personal statement? Nothing yet, but there are rumors that he's going to make a live statement later. Kevin paused. Are you okay, Rafa? I don't know, I answered honestly. I need time to process all this. After hanging up, I stared at the screen, rereading parts of the article. It was work I should be proud of, the kind of investigative journalism that could really change things, force accountability, maybe even inspire regulatory reform. So why couldn't I feel the elation that usually accompanies a big story? My phone vibrated with a notification. Theodore Blackwood would be making a live statement at 4 in the afternoon. It would be his first significant public appearance in years. Over the next few hours, I obsessively followed the repercussions online. The story was being shared thousands of times, generating heated debates. Other publications were beginning to echo our findings, adding their own analysis. Former Blackwood Industries employees were giving interviews, confirming aspects of the report. At 4 o'clock sharp, I sat in front of the television, my heart hammering in my chest as I waited for Theo to appear. The broadcast began with him sitting in a simple chair against a neutral background. No corporate logo, no usual PR paraphernalia. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit, but no tie. A slightly more accessible version of the normally inaccessible executive. Good afternoon, he began, looking directly into the camera. My name is Theodore Elliot Blackwood III, and I am the CEO of Blackwood Industries and chairman of the Elliot Foundation. I am speaking directly to the public today in response to the investigative report published by the Tribune this morning. He paused briefly, his eyes reflecting a determination I recognized from our private conversations. First of all, I want to confirm that the central facts presented in the report are, in essence, true. The Elliot Foundation, created by my grandfather and expanded by my father, has been used over the years not only for genuine philanthropy, but also to facilitate business practices that do not stand up to the ethical scrutiny that the public has a right to expect. I held my breath, stunned by the direct admission. No one had expected this, certainly not the shareholders or the Blackwood board. Since assuming leadership after my father's death, I have worked to transform both the company and the foundation. This process has been slower and more complex than I would have liked, partly due to the deep-rooted structures I inherited, and partly, I must admit, due to my own caution. He paused again, and for a moment I had the strange feeling that he was speaking directly to me. Today's report serves as a catalyst for changes that are not only necessary, but long overdue. Effective immediately, I am announcing the following measures. First, a complete restructuring of the Elliot Foundation board, with the majority of seats being filled by independent experts in philanthropy and ethics. Second, a comprehensive and transparent audit of all the Foundation's activities over the last 10 years, conducted by an external company with no previous ties to Blackwood. Third, complete legal separation between the Foundation and Blackwood Industries to eliminate any potential conflict of interest. Each announcement left me more perplexed. This wasn't a PR exercise or an attempt to minimize damage. It was a fundamental reform. Finally, on a more personal level, Theo continued, his voice softening slightly, I want to address a family story that was mentioned in the report. My mother, Elizabeth Blackwood, did not die in a yachting accident as was reported to the public. She suffers from severe bipolar disorder and lives under specialist care. The decision to fabricate her death was taken by my father, allegedly to protect the family's privacy, but effectively erasing her existence for corporate image reasons. I felt a lump in my throat. It was the story he had told me that first night in his apartment, a personal and painful truth that he was now sharing with the world. As part of my commitment to transparency, I am establishing in my mother's name a new initiative dedicated to the research and treatment of mental disorders, completely separate from the Elliot Foundation and run with total transparency. It's a small attempt to right a big wrong. He looked directly at the camera, his expression open and genuine. Investigative journalism fulfills a vital function in our society. It holds us accountable, especially those of us in positions of power and privilege. Tribune's reporting, while difficult to confront, represents the kind of scrutiny that is necessary and ultimately beneficial. That's why there will be no lawsuits, threats, or retaliation against the paper or its journalists. I knew that last part was a direct message to me, a guarantee, an acknowledgement, perhaps something more. The coming months will be challenging for Blackwood Industries and everyone associated with it. I will not run away from these challenges or try to minimize them. Instead, I will face them squarely, with the same honesty that I hope to demonstrate today. Thank you for your time. The broadcast ended, leaving me in a state of silent shock. My phone immediately started ringing. Kevin, Marina, other colleagues, all wanting my perspective on the unprecedented pronouncement. I ignored all the calls. There was only one person I needed to talk to right now. Without a second thought, I grabbed my keys and left. The doorman at the penthouse on Central Park West recognized me, waving me into the elevator without question. On the way up, my mind raced with contradictory thoughts. What would I say to him? What did his statement mean? Where were we after all this? When the door opened directly into the apartment, I found Theo on the balcony, looking out over the park below. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that contrasted dramatically with Manhattan's skyscraper. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that I had never seen so clearly. You came, he said simply. I watched your speech. Why did you do that? I asked, approaching him. You could have challenged the report, minimized the damage, used your army of lawyers and PR people to control the narrative. I could, he agreed. But then I'd be perpetuating exactly the kind of culture I've always hated, even while maintaining it for convenience. You've risked everything. The board will be furious. The shareholders are probably panicking. You could lose control of the company. A wry smile touched his lips. Do you know what I've realized over the last few weeks? That maybe controlling everything isn't the only way to live. That maybe there are more important things than preserving an empire built on secrets. I took another step towards him. Our bodies now only centimeters apart. Things like integrity, like being able to look at yourself in the mirror without seeing your father's shadow. His hand came up to touch my face, like the chance to be loved for who you are, not for what you own or represent. The emotion in his voice ran through me like an electric current. Theo, I don't expect you to give up your career for me, Rafael. I know how much journalism means to you, how hard you fought to get where you are. Tribune probably doesn't want me back, I admitted, not after the scandal that will erupt when they find out about us. And that destroys you? I considered the question seriously. A few weeks ago, the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. Now, surprisingly, not as much as I expected. I covered his hand on my cheek with my own. I'm still a journalist, with or without Tribune. I still believe in truth, in accountability, in change through information. I've always admired that about you, he said softly. Your unwavering conviction even when it complicated my life. And what about you? What happens now with Theodore Blackwood, the corporate reformer? Months of chaos, probably. Boardroom battles, angry shareholders, painful audits. He shrugged. But for the first time since I took over after my father's death, I feel like I'm actually leading, not just managing. The sun had completely set now, the lights of the city beginning to glow against the darkened sky. We sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the world below, a world we had both tried to change, each in our own way. You still haven't answered my question, he finally said. Where are we, Rafael? After all this? In response, I eliminated the last space between us, my lips meeting his in a kiss that conveyed everything that words couldn't express. Desire, yes, but also admiration, respect, and something much deeper that we were still beginning to understand. When we broke apart, his eyes shone with an emotion that mirrored my own. I think that answers that, he murmured against my lip. It's a start, I replied, pulling him closer. The rest, we'll have to find out together. And as the lights of Manhattan created constellations below us, I allowed myself to believe for the first time that maybe, just maybe, the journalist and the billionaire could write a story that no one expected, a story not about exposure and secrets, but about redemption and the courage to choose a different path. It wouldn't be easy. There would be consequences, adjustments, moments of doubt, but as his arms wrapped around me against the Manhattan night breeze, I knew for sure that, no matter what came next, this was a story worth living. Did you like this even more intense second part? Leave your comments below. What do you think will come for Rafael and Theo when the storm really begins? Keep following for the thrilling conclusion. A week after the story was published, New York was a whirlwind of headlines, speculation, and rumors about the Blackwood empire. The company's shares had plummeted 21%. The board of directors was in almost continuous emergency meetings, and 3 senior executives had already resigned in protest at the new measures announced by Theo. And then, the inevitable happened. Scandalous romance. Journalist who exposed Blackwood was having an acquisition with their heir. Ran the front page of the New York Post with a photo of us kissing on the balcony of Theo's penthouse. Apparently, the blackmail attempt had turned into a sale for the tabloid when the payment didn't come through. My phone didn't stop ringing that morning. Fellow journalists, old contacts, even my mother calling from Florida after seeing the news on TV. Rafael, you have to see this, Kevin said when I finally took his call. It's on all the channels. Fox News is calling you an unethical journalist with a personal agenda. MSNBC is debating whether your story still has credibility. It's crazy. What about Tribune? I asked, dreading the answer. Marina called an emergency meeting. They're discussing how to respond. He hesitated. It doesn't look good, Rafa. I hung up, feeling a mixture of nausea and strange release. The worst I had feared had happened. My relationship with Theo was exposed, my professional reputation under attack. My career at Tribune probably over. And yet, a part of me felt relieved that the secret was over, that the duplicity was over. Have you seen it? Theo asked when I entered the kitchen of his apartment where he had spent the last few nights. He was making coffee, barefoot and with tousled hair, looking much younger and more vulnerable than the CEO facing a corporate crisis. Vi, I took the cup he offered me. The official scandal has begun. How are you? His eyes searched mine, worried. Strangely calm, I replied, surprising us both. It's as if a part of me has been waiting for this, and now that it's happened, I can finally breathe. He smiled, that rare smile I had learned to appreciate. You're more resilient than you think. I'll have to be. Marina is probably writing my resignation letter as we speak, and that scares you less than I expected, he observed, not as a question, but as an observation. What scares me is the idea that all my work, all the research, all the facts we've gathered can be dismissed as a personal agenda. I put the cup down on the counter with more force than necessary. Let the truth about the foundation, about the company's practices, be lost in the spectacle of our relationship. Theo moved closer, his hands finding mine. We won't let that happen. How? By facing everything head-on, without hiding, without backing down. Before I could answer, my phone rang. Marina. I need to take this, I said, reluctantly pulling away from her ringtone. Rafael, her voice sounded exhausted. I imagine you've seen the news. I have. The editorial board met this morning. It was intense. She took a deep breath. There's a general feeling of betrayal, Rafael, that you've compromised not only your integrity, but that of the entire Tribune. I closed my eyes, preparing for the final blow. I understand. I'm officially calling to inform you that you are relieved of your duties at Tribune, effective immediately. His professional voice barely masked his personal disappointment. Your access to the system will be revoked in the next few hours. HR will be in touch about exit procedures. Even though I had anticipated this, the words still hurt like stab wounds. 8 years of my life, my professional identity, all ending in a phone call of less than 2 minutes. Marina, officially, that's the newspaper's position, she interrupted me. Unofficially, I'm disappointed, Rafael. Not just because of the relationship itself, but because you didn't trust me enough to be honest before everything blew up. I should have told you, I admitted. I was afraid. Yes, you should have. And now we're all dealing with the consequences. She paused. For what it's worth, your reporting is still solid. The facts have been checked, the sources are legitimate. Even with the personal complications, the journalistic work was impeccable. Thanks for that, at least. Take care, Rafael. And the next time you uncover a big story, remember to keep your pants buckled during the investigation. Despite everything, a small smile touched my lips. It was the kind of biting comment I always appreciated from her. Bye, Marina. When I hung up, Theo was watching me from across the kitchen, giving me space to process what had just happened. I've been fired, I informed him, the reality of the situation finally hitting me like a wave. 8 years of career ended in a 2-minute phone call. Within 3 steps, he was at my side, his arms wrapping me in a firm embrace. I allowed myself to sink against his chest, a whirlwind of emotions, anger, sadness, fear, relief, washing over me in waves. I'm sorry, he murmured against my hair. I know how much the Tribune meant to you. The worst thing is that I can't even blame them, I replied, my voice muffled against his shirt. I did exactly what I would always criticize in another journalist, and yet you didn't regret the truth you exposed. I pulled away to look at his face. How do you cope, with your world crumbling around you? A sad smile touched his lips. Years of training in crisis management, and the certainty that, unlike my father, I'm finally doing the right thing, even if it's the hardest. Just then, my phone rang again. This time, an unknown number from Washington, D.C. Rafael Mendez? A female voice, direct and professional. This is Nora Chen, executive editor of the Capital Inquirer. Would you have a few minutes to talk about a position that just opened up on our investigative team? Over the following weeks, the storm intensified before beginning to subside. The story of the journalist who fell in love with the subject of his investigation captured the public imagination in a way that none of us could have predicted. We were featured on talk shows, the subject of passionate editorials, the subject of ethical debates in journalism schools. To my surprise, not all the reactions were negative. While some accused me of compromising journalistic integrity, others saw the story as something more complex, a study in ethics, truth, and personal transformation. The offer from the Capital Inquirer was just the first of many. Publications that valued investigative journalism looked beyond the scandal, recognizing the value of the work I had done. To my surprise, the episode that I had feared would destroy my career was actually opening new doors. Theo was facing his own challenges. The Blackwood Industries Board tried to remove him in an emergency vote, but failed by a narrow margin. 2 major shareholders sold their stakes, causing the stock to fall further. A group of institutional investors demanded explanations not only about the exposed practices, but also about his reckless personal behavior. Throughout this maelstrom, we stuck together, finding strength in each other that neither of us knew we possessed. The board is divided, Theo informed me after a particularly tense meeting as we prepared dinner in the kitchen of his apartment, now our apartment, since I left my place in Brooklyn 2 weeks after the scandal broke. Half want to oust me immediately. The other half recognize that the changes I've announced are the only way to avoid even more severe regulatory investigations. And what happens now? I asked, chopping vegetables while he prepared the sauce. Irony supreme. The scandal of our relationship ended up giving me more bargaining power. He smiled wryly. If they oust me now, it will look like retaliation for my ethical reforms, not a consequence of our scandalous affair. Narrative manipulation. I smiled back. Almost admirable. I've learned from the best. He approached me from behind, wrapping his arms around my waist and kissing my neck. A certain journalist taught me a lot about the power of stories. I turned in his arms, the knife still in my hand. Careful, I'm still armed. You always are. His eyes shone with a mixture of desire and admiration. It's one of the things I love about you. That word, love, still caused an electric current between us, even after weeks together. It was a continuous revelation to discover that what had started as antagonism, then forbidden desire, had turned into something so deep, so true. Speaking of sharp things, I continued, placing the knife on the board, I got an interesting offer today from The Atlantic, an investigative series on pharmaceutical corporations, focusing specifically on how they manipulate mental health research. His eyes lit up with genuine interest. Perfect for you, combining your investigative experience with my newly developed interest in mental health, yes. I completed his thought naturally, something we did more and more often. There's just one complication. What? I'd need to interview experts from the Elizabeth Initiative. The Elizabeth Initiative, the mental health project that Theo had announced in his speech, was already in rapid development, with researchers and experts hired and an independent administrative structure being formed. And you're worried about conflict of interest, he concluded, understanding immediately. Exactly. After everything that's happened, I need to be impeccable in ethical terms. I can't risk any appearance of favoritism or privileged access. Theo considered for a moment, turning away to stir the sauce. What if we maintained a strict separation? The initiative's researchers wouldn't know about our relationship until after the interviews, and you'd completely reveal your personal connection to me in the article. It could work, I agreed, resuming chopping the vegetables. But it would be complicated. When hasn't it been? He smiled. Rafael, one of the things I've learned from you is that ethics doesn't lie in avoiding complex situations, but in navigating them with honesty and transparency. Wise words coming from the man who, just a few months ago, was the guardian of one of the country's most secretive corporate empire. The transformation we had both undergone sometimes seemed almost surreal. 2 months after the exposure of our relationship, when the dust was beginning to settle, we faced our first major public test together. The Association of Investigative Journalists had invited me to be on a panel about journalistic ethics, a controversial choice that generated heated debate in the community. The topic, When Personal Becomes Professional, Navigating Ethical Lines in Modern Journalism. Are you sure you want to do this? Theo asked as I prepared to leave. It'll be like walking into a lion's den. I have to face it at some point, I replied, adjusting my tie in the mirror. Hiding would only reinforce the narrative that I've done something shameful. And you didn't? He arched an eyebrow, his reflection meeting mine in the mirror. I've done something complicated, I corrected. Something that defies traditional norms. But shameful? No, I could never be ashamed of what we find in each other. He turned me to face him, his hands firmly on my shoulders. Be careful there. Not everyone will see the nuances. Some just want blood. I'm counting on it. I smiled. I'll have my own chance to change the narrative. The auditorium was packed when I arrived. Journalists, students, ethics professors, all drawn to the spectacle as much as the substance. I recognized faces from competing publications, some of whom had written particularly scathing editorials about my unforgivable ethical lapse. The moderator, a respected journalism professor from Columbia, introduced the panel. Me, an international correspondent who had married a source, and an editor who had faced similar ethical dilemmas throughout his career. Mr. Mendez, he began after the initial introductions, many would say that you broke the most fundamental rule of investigative journalism, maintaining objective distance from the subject of your reporting. How do you respond to that accusation? I took a deep breath, feeling all eyes on me. I would break that rule again, I replied, causing an immediate murmur in the audience. Not because I devalue journalistic objectivity, but because I've discovered that true ethics lies not in rigid rules, but in honesty, with sources, with the public, and crucially, with oneself. Are you suggesting that romantic involvement with sources is acceptable? Asked a veteran journalist in the front row, her skepticism evident. I'm suggesting that the real world is more complex than our ethics manuals, that we are human before we are journalists. and that sometimes, rarely but significantly, we find ourselves in situations that challenge our traditional understanding of professional boundaries. Convenient, coming from someone who has crossed those boundaries, commented another panelist sarcastically. Yes, it is convenient, I agreed, surprising him. And it's also true. My experience has given me a perspective I didn't have before. That doesn't invalidate the perspective, it just puts it into context. The debate continued, sometimes heated, sometimes genuinely curious. I defended myself when necessary, admitted mistakes where they existed, and above all, refused to apologize for the relationship that had transformed my life. One last question, said the moderator after almost 2 hours. If you could go back, would you do anything differently? I paused to consider seriously. I would have been more transparent earlier. I would have trusted my editors to find an ethical path together instead of hiding something I knew was potentially compromising. I paused, looking at the audience. But I wouldn't have stifled what I discovered with Theodore Blackwood. Some connections are too rare, too powerful to be denied in the name of professional conventions. The trick is not to use them as an excuse to compromise the truth, but as motivation to find it even when it hurts. As I left the stage, I noticed a familiar figure at the back of the auditorium. Theo had arrived silently during the debate, watching without interfering, his gaze brimming with a pride that warmed me inside. "You were incredible," he said when we met in the lobby, keeping a respectful distance in public, but his eyes communicating everything he couldn't physically express. Honest, articulate, and completely unflappable. "I learned from the best," I replied with a small smile. "A certain CEO taught me a lot about facing hostile audiences." We walked outside together, aware of the stares that followed us, the cell phone cameras discreetly pointed in our direction. This was our reality now, an object of public interest, a symbol of a complex ethical debate, characters in a story that transcended our individual lives. "Mr. Blackwood! Mr. Mendez!" A young, bold reporter intercepted us on the sidewalk. "How do you respond to the accusations that your relationship compromises the integrity of the original investigation?" We exchanged a quick glance, a silent communication we had perfected. "The real question," I replied, "is not whether our relationship compromised the investigation, but whether the facts reported were true. Theodore Blackwood has publicly confirmed that they were. The rest is noise." "What about the future?" the reporter insisted. "How do you navigate between your potentially conflicting careers?" Theo took this question. "With honesty, transparency, and mutual respect for our separate missions." His tone was calm, professional, but there was an underlying firmness that conveyed conviction. "Rafael remains a journalist dedicated to the truth. I continue to lead a company in transformation. Where these missions intersect, we navigate with redoubled ethical care. But at the end of the day," I added, unable to resist, "we are just two people who have found something unexpected in each other, something worth protecting even under public scrutiny." The young reporter looked from one to the other, clearly not having expected this level of frankness. "That's an impressively honest answer. We're trying a new approach," Theo replied with a slight smile. "Radical honesty. It's working well for us so far." 6 months later, a lot had changed. The series on pharmaceutical corporations for The Atlantic was a critical success, restoring much of my professional credibility. Blackwood Industries, under Theo's continued leadership despite multiple attempts to oust him, had implemented significant reforms, completely separating the Elliot Foundation and setting a new standard for corporate transparency. But the most profound change was more personal. Theo had sold the penthouse in Central Park and bought a modest but elegant house in Brooklyn, a compromise between his world and mine. We divided our time between New York and occasional trips to France, where Theo had finally established a caring relationship with his mother, not as a son, as she didn't yet recognize him as such, but as a gentle visitor who brought books and news from the outside world. "I think she's suspicious," he told me after our third visit. "There are times when she looks at me as if she's trying to remember something important, as if she recognizes me from somewhere." "Give her time," I advised, entwining my fingers in his as we walked through the gardens of the secluded estate on the outskirts of Nice. Some truths need to be revealed gradually. That night, as the Mediterranean moon illuminated our hotel room, Theo turned to me with an expression I recognized. that mixture of vulnerability and determination that had captivated me from the start. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his fingers tracing gentle patterns on my arm, "about how it all began, how you came into my life determined to expose my secrets, and how you welcomed me determined to manipulate and neutralize me," I added with a smile. "Exactly," he smiled back. "We started out as adversaries, each representing something the other distrusted or even despised. And look at us now," I murmured, leaning over to kiss his bare shoulder. "Yes, look at us!" He propped himself up on one elbow, his blue eyes intense in the dim light. "Journalist and tycoon, Queens and Upper East Side, expositor of truths and keeper of secrets, all these contradictions, but somehow working," I added. "More than working." His hand found my face, his touch reverent. "Rafael, you've transformed my life. You showed me that there is power in vulnerability, strength in transparency. You taught me that some secrets need to be exposed for healing to begin. And you taught me that not everything is black and white," I replied, my heart racing with the intensity of his gaze. "That sometimes the most important truth is the one that can't be captured in headlines or reports." He took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "I have one last secret to share with you." "Another corporate scandal?" I teased gently. "No," he smiled, his thumb caressing my cheek. "This one is purely personal." With a fluid movement, he reached for something on the bedside table, a small velvet box that made my heart stop for a moment. "I didn't plan this," he confessed, opening the box to reveal 2 simple platinum rings. "In fact, I spent months trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect place. Then I realized that there's no such thing as perfection, only real moments like this. Theo," my voice faltered, emotion closing my throat. "Rafael Mendez, you turned my world upside down. You exposed me, you challenged me, and then, inexplicably, you loved me despite everything you discovered." His eyes shone in the soft light. "Would you marry me? Would you continue this unlikely story for as long as it lasts?" The answer was on my lips instantly, without hesitation or analysis, just pure, crystal-clear certainty. "Yes," I replied, pulling him to me. "Absolutely yes." When his lips met mine, it was like our first kiss all over again. That same electric current, that same sensation of freefall, of boundaries being crossed, of infinite possibilities opening up. "You know," I murmured against his lips, "this is going to generate another wave of headlines. Controversial journalist marries billionaire he investigated." "Let them talk," he replied, sliding a ring onto my finger. "Some stories aren't meant to be understood by everyone, only lived by those at the center of them." And as the Mediterranean night enveloped our most intimate reconciliation, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought us here, from the shadows of corporate secrets and journalistic ambitions to this moment of crystal clarity. The man I had determined to expose was now exposing his heart to me, and I, who had dedicated my life to uncovering hidden truths, was finally finding the most important one of all, that some connections transcend all categories, all expectations, all rules. That sometimes the greatest act of courage is not to expose secrets, but to create something new and true from them. Our wedding, held a year later in an isolated vineyard in Tuscany, was reported in all the major publications, but with less sensationalism than we had feared. Time had turned our scandal story into something more lasting. A case study in ethics, transformation, and redemption that was now being discussed in journalism schools and business schools. Theo was still running Blackwood Industries, but in a way that his father would hardly recognize. The company had become a model of corporate transparency, its questionable practices replaced by innovative initiatives in sustainability and social responsibility. The Elliot Foundation, now completely independent and run by an autonomous board, focused exclusively on genuine causes without obscure tax benefits. As for me, I turned down offers from major publications to follow a more independent path. I founded the Transparency Project, a digital platform dedicated to in-depth investigative journalism on corporate and institutional power. We maintained a strict separation. We never investigated Blackwood or its subsidiaries to avoid any appearance of conflict. There were more than enough companies to investigate. The Elizabeth Initiative flourished under expert leadership, becoming a pioneering force in mental disorder research and treatment. Elizabeth Blackwood, although she never fully recovered her memories, developed a warm relationship with the gentle young American who visited her regularly, a relationship that brought joy to both her and Theo. Our life together wasn't perfect. There were occasional disagreements about where legitimate privacy ends and lack of transparency begins, debates about privilege and responsibility, moments when our different backgrounds and perspectives collided. But there was also a deep respect for the differences that defined us, an appreciation for the unlikely path that brought us together. On our third wedding anniversary, as we watched the sunset from our home in Brooklyn, Theo handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked, intrigued. "Open it." Inside, I found documentation of a new scholarship established in my name at Columbia Journalism School, dedicated specifically to students from immigrant communities interested in investigative journalism, so that other Rafaels can find their voice, he explained, his eyes shining with that unique blend of vulnerability and strength that had captivated me from the start, so that the truth continues to find its defenders. I pulled him to me, at a loss for words to express the emotion that flooded through me. This man, who once represented everything I sought to expose and bring down, was now my deepest partner in the mission to create a more transparent and just world. "Do you know what still fascinates me?" I murmured against his hair. "How it all started with you trying to manipulate me and me trying to expose you. And we both succeeded in a way," he replied with a smile. "You exposed my secrets to the world. I manipulated my way into your heart." "Pretty effective manipulation," I agreed, kissing him softly. "The best investment I've ever made," he joked, although we knew there was a deeper truth there. As night fell over Brooklyn, I thought of all the headlines, all the articles, all the comments our story had generated over the years. None of them really captured the essence of what we had found in each other. The profound transformation that occurs when we allow someone to see beyond our defenses, when we find the courage to expose not just other people's secrets, but our own. As a journalist, I was always looking for the definitive truth behind the facades. As Theo's partner, I learned that some truths can't be fully articulated, only lived, day after day, in the small choices, the shared vulnerabilities, the ongoing work of building something honest from an unlikely beginning. And perhaps that was the most important story of all. Not the one printed in headlines or discussed on panels, but the one we wrote together every day. A story of two worlds colliding and, against all odds, creating something entirely new from the fragments. Leave your comment below and share what impacted you most about Rafael and Theo's journey.